Hello and welcome to the Keep Northern Beautiful podcast. In this episode, we are going to be looking at the issue of fast fashion and what we can do about it, some of the policy implications of it, some of the limitations of our current approaches towards dealing with it, and most importantly, what you can do as a consumer to help us turn the tide on fast fashion. And to go through this critically important topic, we have two specialists in this field. We have Dermot McGilloway from St Vincent de Paul, one of the biggest charities on the island of Ireland, who are at the coalface of this issue. And we'll also be hearing from Dr. Patsy Perry, who is a reader in fashion marketing at Manchester Metropolitan University, later in the podcast about some of the policy implications and where the UK is in tackling this issue. But first up, we speak to Dermot from St Vincent de Paul. Dermot, you're very welcome to the Keep Northern Beautiful podcast.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
Dermot, just give us a wee bit of context first. If you could set the scene, talk us through a bit of the growth in production and consumption of clothing and textiles and the problems that are facing society as a result.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the fashion industry in itself it's not a bad thing. It's a $2.5 trillion industry, and I think it's employing 75 million people worldwide. So we all need clothes. We love buying. We all love a bit of retail therapy. And I think it was Ursula de Castro, the co-founder of Fashion Revolution, that called clothing our chosen skin. So people express themselves by what they wear, and that's great. The problem, I think, arises when you start looking at the whole concept of fast fashion, which is basically mass production for maximum profit, and that's where the wheels really start to fall off. The statistics are kind of mind blowing. They're so mind blowing that nearly you need to go back and kind of reality check that there's not too many zeros on there. There's estimates that there's 100 to 150 billion garments being made annually across the globe. And when you start to break down what those garments are made of, nearly 3/4 of them are made of synthetic, non-biodegradable materials. And I think there's 70 million barrels of oil are going in annually to the making of the plastics that's making the polyester that's making our clothes. So that is it's a massive drain on the resources of the planet and on the people that live in it. And it gets even worse because when you then consider that 70% of those items end up in landfill, you start to wonder about the wisdom of it and the futility of it is the ultimate. And it spawns the sector in itself, and this mass consumption is spawning multiple problems from an environmental point of view, but also from a social point of view. And that's where the St Vincent de Paul gets a bit more interested in it.
Yeah, and you've just given some just on some of those figures there, Dermot. I mean, the barrels of oil, the amount of production that's happening. I mean, that's absolutely incredible numbers. And again, just from your position, from where you can see, I mean, in terms of this growth, what's the impact of that on your business and on your charity? To say it more accurately, what impact are you seeing?
Well, the charity itself is trying to slow down the impact of fast fashion, but I mean, SVP is a global organisation, and if you don't mind me talking about our green credentials for just a wee second, we're in about 155 countries and territories, and the society is assisting 30 million people a day across the globe in a variety of settings, including those I'm sure that are working in the sweatshops across the planet where these clothes are getting made. We're an advisor to the UN Economic and Social Council, and we're also aligned with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and we're very closely aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that were set to basically end poverty and to protect the planet and to promote peace and prosperity. Another interesting little bit of trivia, we're probably the third largest charity retailer on the planet. We've over 1,500 stores around the globe. And the only charity retailers bigger than us are Goodwill and Salvation Army, to the best of our knowledge. So I think we're actually very, very well placed as a social justice charity that also has commitments to the protection of the earth. They actually take a view on this. So the society's got this dual issue of, on the one hand, dealing with poverty and deprivation in society on the one hand, and then also trying to kind of pare back the excesses of overconsumption of fast fashion on the other. So this really interesting dilemma for us. And from a fast fashion point of view, we don't see any positives. As I said already, from an environmental point of view, there are 8 clear impacts that it's having on society, from water pollution and the water consumption, microfibers breaking down off these fabrics and polluting our oceans, waste accumulation, chemicals getting used and the addiction that there is now in the sector to using chemicals. I saw a really scary figure there recently that there's over 3,500 chemicals used in the production of textiles, and 750 of them are harmful to humans, either by direct exposure or getting into the food chain when people are consuming them. And then you get into the whole labour rights issues. As I said already, there's an estimated 40 million people working in sweatshops globally, and even scarier, 175 million kids missing school, involved in a child labour situation, working in these sweatshops. And then you've got, exposure to harmful substances, you've got abuse, you've got all of those things happening. So there really are no positives in terms of fast fashion. And we're doing it within the sector, and have taken a slightly unique approach to it ourselves, where we're simply trying to slow down the pernicious effect of fast fashion.
Well, you've talked a wee bit about the charity retail sector. Could you just tell us a wee bit about how you're keeping clothing, textiles in circulation for as long as possible, and how you guys actually provide a vital role in actually, tackling the problem of fast fashion and making sure that the perfectly good clothes, items, textiles get reused again?
Yeah, sure. Love to do that. I mean, again, to put it into context, if you think that 100 billion garments are getting made a year, I think back in 2018-19, there was about 350,000 tonnes of textiles donated to charity shops across the UK. So it's a drop in the ocean. But you have to start somewhere. SVP in Ireland is an all-island organisation. We estimate that we're keeping about 15,000 tonnes at a landfill. But that's over 100,000 tonnes of carbon that's not been released into the environment as a result of it. And I suppose we're trying to stay true to our Vincentian principles of getting the most out of what people give us. So if you leave a bag of clothes into one of our shops, we are what is unfashionably called double dippers. We'll dip into the bag in the shop and try to get the maximum value out of it. And we'll share that in the local shop and in the local cluster of shops. Example, Belfast, Antrim Road in Belfast. There's 4 other shops in the vicinity. And so the guys there will share between those 5 shops anything that's more suited to one location than another. But we've actually built up an internal program of order fulfillment centres, which is a fancy term for clothes sharing centres. And we've 8 of them now on the island. And we want to make sure that every shop in our network of 230 shops is within 90 minutes of one or other of those. And that's where the second dip happens. The surplus that hasn't been sold off at the local shop is going into the order fulfillment centres, and we have teams of specialists going through there, extracting any possible extra value. And then we're using EPOS technology then to track the movement of those goods, track sales patterns around the country. And we want to also be conscious of our carbon footprint where transport. So we're getting into route optimization. So we're not going to be selling product from one shop to another if we don't think it's going to sell. So we have to be mindful. We can't be kind of penny wise, pound foolish with any of this. So we're making a really genuine effort across the island to keep the goods out of landfill. And then whatever we haven't managed to sell through the local shop, give away in emergency assistance, give away through our home visits, through our conferences, or send on to an order fulfillment centre, then it'll get sold on then to recycling companies. And we're also very, very particular about who we deal with there. And the 2 companies who we deal with, who are both based in Northern Ireland, actually, are fully signed up members of the trust programme, which basically means that they're licensed to do everything they need to do in terms of collection, in terms of grading the goods, and in terms of export. So, we're really trying to make sure that from front door to back door, that we're taking responsibility and taking some ownership over the garment, which I think is what people would expect when they donate to SVP.
Yeah, and obviously you are providing an important role, not just obviously in the community, but also if you think about local government, for example, who deal with waste. And we were chatting on another podcast here recently on the issue of waste with someone who's an expert in local government waste, just about how important, local authorities are in terms of dealing with waste, but also the fact that it's their biggest cost. Could you walk us through just a wee bit there about the benefits of what it is that St Vincent de Paul are doing in terms of actually keeping things out of landfill and keeping things within a more circular economy in the medium to longer term?
Well, absolutely. I mean, from a legislative point of view, I mean, the world is now demanding a change in this area. From your Paris agreement back in 2015 to your Sustainable Development Goals, to your EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, through to I think from the UK perspective, the 2018 paper, Our Waste, Our Resources, a Strategy for England. I mean, there was clear commitments given that I think one of the main elements of it was this extended producer responsibility, where people who make or sell clothes are going to be actually financially liable for the responsible disposal of them. So, I mean, the world is demanding a more responsible, more ethical handling of textiles. And if charity shops weren't there, these things would be getting dumped into landfills. It would be getting into people's waste bins. And I don't know about the UK, actually. I'm a bit confused about the position, but certainly in the EU, it's now a legal requirement that textiles will be collected separately from the start of 2025. So that's a big cost for local authorities. And if SVP's keeping 15 to 20,000 tonnes of goods out of that landfill and is using its own resources to redistribute those goods repeatedly. And as I say, we don't just sell stuff. SVP shops have got this unique local dual function where we are a fundraiser for money going back into the community, but actually we're a service provider. We're as happy to give clothes away to people that need them through emergency assistance or through visiting people in their homes, addressing fuel poverty or just an absence of clothing or food as we are to sell. So we will use every avenue at our disposal to safely redistribute these goods. And that's a huge burden taken off local authorities. And we really don't ask for much in return, actually. It would be good to get access to a few more sites in terms of getting our textile banks out and about. And we would certainly like the Northern Ireland Environmental Agency to take a slightly firmer hand on some of these clothing collectors who are masquerading as clothing graders and exporters, and they're not. And the thing to say here is, and it's probably a conversation for another day, there's a massive scandal brewing overseas because a lot of the goods that the UK are disposing of are getting dumped off the coast of Africa. And there's an environmental catastrophe brewing off the African coast again. So this isn't just restricted to local authorities. And there's plenty that we would be asking in terms of the UK government as well. Basically, to honour the commitments that were laid out in the 2018 paper.
Yeah, and obviously you've spoken there a wee bit about the challenges that St Paul face at the minute. But, you know, what more could be done to help you and support you guys in what you're trying to do in terms of actually, you know, tackling this issue of fast fashion, creating a more circular economy in the UK? And I know you've already alluded to some of those things, but just is there anything else that could be done in order to help you enhance or develop that work further?
Well, I mean, St Vincent de Paul is one of these odd organisations that wishes it didn't exist. Like, we wish there was no need for St Vincent de Paul, either in terms of poverty and deprivation or fast fashion, but we are here and we just want the infrastructure to be in place to help us to get these goods collected, get them sorted, and deal with reputable exporters when exporters are in the market. And if we know that there are companies out there that are not reputable, that they're dealt with. I mean, from a wider governmental point of view, that extended producer responsibility programme works well in France, starting to work well in Sweden. I know the UK government are focused very much on getting the packaging part of it right before the textile part, but it needs to be dealt with. Eco-design, making clothes more durable to begin with. We don't want people having to spend money on clothes unnecessarily. That's one of the reasons why we get 230,000 calls a year across the island of Ireland. People can't afford the basics. So we'd far rather that they bought a coat and wore it for 5 years than wore it once and threw it away. Restricting access to landfills and incineration and investing more in the whole recycling infrastructure is a big one. But you know, a lot of our garments do end up overseas, and the recycling companies that we deal with, the reputable ones, nearly 80% of what they get, they are reusing overseas. And we want to see much cleaner standards in place. We want the government to assist that if we're exporting goods out of the UK to the African market, that there are some standards in place to make sure that you know, that these societies aren't being abused. I think it's a Trashing group in Kenya talking about waste colonialism, where the UK is just dumping its stuff on the African coast with no regard for the people that are living there. So, you know, the St Vincent de Paul's in Africa as well. The St Vincent de Paul in Northern Ireland actually supports Ghana through a twinning programme, and yet there's 15 million garments a week being exported out to Accra through the UK sector alone, and 5 million of those garments end up in landfills or lying on streets or storm drains or getting washed out to sea. So even in that example of Ghana, SVP in Northern Ireland is twinned with them at the same time as the UK charity sector's dumping waste onto those coasts. So that there's an inconsistency there in terms of our fundamental beliefs, in terms of working in society.
Yeah, Dermot, you've done a phenomenal job of actually just giving us the scale of the problem, but also some of the really cool ways actually in which the charity sector are actually helping, pardon the pun, turn the tide really on the issue of fast fashion. And St Vincent de Paul, of course, are as you've pointed out here, one of our biggest charities. So look, can I thank you for coming along and for giving your views to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. They've been absolutely insightful. So thank you very much for coming along and speaking to us today.
Thanks very much, David. David, can I say one last plug for SVP? If any of your listeners are out there and they actually need assistance from St Vincent de Paul, we're not just here to kind of slow down the impact of fast fashion. So will they go to the SVP website or pick up the phone if people need assistance or they need a home visit, which is fundamentally why we're here?
No problem at all. And St Vincent de Paul, of course, are all across social media, and you guys have a website as well if people want to go and find out more details. You've been listening to Dermot McGilloway, who is National Retail Development Manager at St Vincent de Paul. Now we're going to look at some of the policy implications of fast fashion and, more importantly, what we can do about them. And to go through this, we're going to chat now to Dr. Patsy Perry. Patsy Perry is a reader in fashion marketing at Manchester Metropolitan University, and we are absolutely delighted to have her on the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. Patsy, you're very welcome.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me today.
So, Patsy, my first question to you is, why is the issue of fast fashion important?
So fast fashion is cheaply manufactured, disposable clothing that is produced very quickly and sold at very low prices, which enables consumers to revamp their wardrobes on a constant basis without spending too much money. But it really encourages consumers to buy and discard clothing at an increasingly alarming rate. And because it's so cheaply manufactured, corners are cut in production. So that leads to pollution, textile dyes and so on, water pollution. It also leads to labour exploitation and people not being treated very well when they're manufacturing it, plus huge volumes of textile waste when people are disposing of clothing that they don't want to wear anymore. And we haven't really figured out what to do with it. And of course, all of the associated carbon emissions through that production process. And given that it's not kept for very long or worn for very long, and sometimes not even worn at all, because people, maybe buy something cheap in the sale, change their mind, don't really like it, doesn't fit, and so on. So all of those resources that go into producing it across that supply chain from, the agriculture side in terms of growing the cotton, maybe the polyester in terms of extracting that, the manufacturing of the materials, the sewing of the garments, the shipping from one country to another. And bear in mind, some of these garments are probably better travelled than you or I could ever hope to be. But all of that is wasted because then they're disposed of without really being worn, which is an awful shame. 1/3 of all clothing that's produced in the world is never sold. So we have this huge problem of overproduction, and it's really leading to tremendous problems in carbon emissions, which we're trying to cut, for climate change and so on, plus this ever-growing mountain of textile waste. Because, what do we do with things that we don't know? So something like 300,000 tonnes of textiles are being thrown into household black bins every year. In the UK, and then sent to landfill or incinerators. Plus, you've got all of the stuff that then ends up harming people in other countries, such as ending up on beaches in Africa, in the Atacama Desert, and so on. So it really exposes that this dumping of unwanted textile waste is a huge problem environmentally for many people around the world.
And where is the UK policy-wise on this, Patsy? I mean, you've given some incredible statistics there. 1/3 of clothes just not being used. Where's the UK in the fight against this?
We're a little bit behind, if the truth be told, compared to other countries in Europe. So a few years ago, back in 2019, the Environmental Audit Committee did some research and published a brilliant report called Fixing Fashion, which you can have a Google for and download and read online, which made a number of recommendations to UK government, as to how this problem, this unsustainable problem of fast fashion overproduction and consumption could be mitigated. But the government pushed back on all of those recommendations, such as extended producer responsibility, reducing VAT on repairs and so on. So we're not really anywhere near where we need to be in terms of policy and legislation at the moment. if we look at it compared to the EU, so the EU will require separate collection of textiles by 2025, which is only a couple of years away. And the European Commission proposed mandatory extended producer responsibility for textiles to really make brands responsible for the products they place on the market and the associated end of life costs. But we haven't implemented that, and it doesn't seem like that's really going to be a going concern anytime soon.
Okay. And Patsy, what do you think the limitation? Because obviously there's a myriad of different approaches that we're taking in tackling this issue. What are the limitations of those current approaches? Because quite often people think about, well, I want to do something, but they don't know what to do and they don't know how to do it. So what are some of the limitations of the approaches that we're taking so far?
So we've got recycling. So recycling is quite a popular approach for many different materials, from plastic bottles, aluminium cans, tin cans, and so on. So I think we're mostly all quite familiar with recycling, but it is problematic for textiles because textiles and the fabrics that we use for clothing, they're made up of so many multiple different types of materials. So it's not as simple as, recycling glass bottle, which can go, infinitely. So currently, recycling old clothing and making it into new clothing isn't viable at scale. So that technology doesn't exist. So therefore, most recycling ends up being what we call downcycling, which is recycling it, but into something that's of a lower value. So your brand new shirt that you decided it doesn't actually fit, or you don't like the color after all, you give it back to whatever retailer on the high street, they're going to recycle it, but it might end up being not made into something new of value, but actually just being made into industrial mattress stuffing or rags or something like that, insulation for buildings, which is still a good end use, but the value is significantly reduced. So what we want to do is keep things in as higher value as possible for as long as possible. So therefore, recycling isn't really a solution to overproduction. We need to really stop producing so much and keep things in use for longer at their original form, or think about upcycling. So, if you're into your vintage stuff, you might have seen, upcycled garments, which are kind of remade or things added to them or whatever, which makes them even more, appealing and valuable and fixing things. But, recycling is definitely not a solution. Another approach that's quite popular is the idea of reuse. So, making things have a longer life, perhaps with another owner, or being reused in different ways. However, when we think about fast fashion, the quality of the materials, the styling of the products, it means it's not always suitable for reuse by, people. And in countries where there is a demand for used clothing, such as refugees or poorer people around the world. So, your typical bodycon, miniskirts, boob tubes, and so on is not going to be of any much use for, a farmer in Pakistan, for example. So therefore, exporting used clothing may, in fact, end up being a burden for some of these countries rather than being helpful. To make reuse really work, it relies on meticulous sorting, which is absolutely very time consuming. So if you think about the volume of stuff that might be donated to charity shops or into the banks in car parks, council bins and so on, all of that stuff, you don't know what people are going to donate, but we really need to meticulously sort that into bales, which are then going to be useful for people in different countries, and what you send to a cold country is going to be different than what you send to a hot country. But what happens is that often clothes that are baled for export to poorer countries, they're not well sorted. So by the time they get to, say, somewhere like Ghana or Africa or whatever, the market sellers that buy these bales, they're cutting into them, but they find that a lot of what's in that bale is actually waste or not usable for them, so they can't actually sell it on. So we end up just exporting waste, which is going to end up being dumped on those countries. So therefore, these garments end up in unintended locations, like on beaches, in deserts and so on, and they occupy, really valuable space, because people want to go on the beaches, don't they? Want to walk in the desert or use it for whatever, not just be a dumping ground for, soiled or damaged clothing that we haven't bothered to sort properly, and also releasing pollutants into the soil and water. So there's a lot of work to be done around reuse as well, and how can we, there's too much stuff being donated to be able to be sold through charity shops. So we have to export some of it, but it really is, problematic. And there's been instances. The new report by Changing Markets Foundation think tank has just come out, looking at what they call take back trickery. So where some of the high street stores say you can drop off bags of unwanted clothing into the bins in the store when you're in town shopping, you often get a voucher to encourage that. And we think, that these things are going to be therefore given to people who could wear them. Sometimes people are donating things with tags on that are brand new, just don't fit, or they haven't returned them in time, and so on. So in all good faith, we bring our stuff back to the shops, we donate them thinking that somebody else is going to be able to make use of what we don't want. But there's been instances where they've tagged some of these products in Europe and found that actually within a week, brand new items with the tags on were shredded and destroyed. So, and people think that they're going to be given to somebody who could make use of them or raise money for charity. So there is quite a lot of, trickery. And ultimately, these take back schemes are, in a way, encouraging more consumption, because you're given a voucher, aren't you, to go and buy new stuff in the store. So a lot of them are incentivized with that. So it's not really helping to kind of slow down consumption and reduce this huge amount of overproduction and wastefulness.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. Just some of the different drawbacks that really are there, and some of the things that we think maybe are helpful, but actually they're not. And the third world is paying a good bit of a price. And we've actually spoken to some people in the charity sector who've relayed some of this problem as well to Patsy. Just on obviously the UK, the national government, but the regional devolved administrations as well. I mean, what can they be doing? I mean, what are the things we could be getting governments to do, or lobbying governments to press governments for? To actually make change and to actually alleviate some of the problems that you've just really outlined very well there.
So we really need to see extended producer responsibility legislation for fashion and textiles, because it's the only way really to level the playing fields and make brands accountable, because otherwise it's purely voluntary what they do. We need to have restrictions on landfill and incineration as they do in France. So you can't just destroy or shred perfectly good products. We need to look at the design of products to make them, if they are going to have a longer lifespan and be able to be reworn by other people, sold on and shared and so on, they need to have better durability and also better design for recyclability, if that's going to be the end point of there, together with effective product labeling so people know what they're buying. Of course, we probably need support from grants and loans to develop the infrastructure needed for recycling at scale. And then also we need to think about how we're going to collect these garments. So, we need to do separate textiles collections, but we need to make it easy for people. So there's been lots of different ways thought of, from, plastic bags that you put outside your house in the morning, but again, then that's susceptible to the weather. So the way that we collect textiles needs to be different to the way that we collect, plastic bottles and tin cans. It doesn't matter if they get a bit wet, or cardboard, that doesn't even matter. You can still recycle it. But once textiles get wet, that's it. The game is over. So they need to be destroyed, because there's no sorting or reuse facility in the world that is going to spend time, taking in huge tons and tons of textiles and then drying them out and washing them. So, there's a bit of responsibility for consumers as well, in terms of giving clean things, dry things, but also we need to think about how can we collect them to keep them clean and dry before they get to the facility where they're sorted for either reuse or recycling.
Yeah, and you've laid very nicely on there to my last question to you. And again, one thing that we're always preaching here at Keeping Our Land Beautiful is that individuals can make a difference, and that we can all do some things a bit differently, and that collectively that can make a big change. What about consumer power in this? I mean, in terms of, you've mentioned a couple of things there that consumers can do when they're being able to get some things reused. But is there anything else that a consumer can do to make them feel like, okay, I've listened, David, Patsy, I've listened to the two of you. I've heard the conversations throughout the podcast. I'm really committed to doing something. How do they recognize their own power to be able to bring about change?
Well, consumers are really powerful, aren't they? Because we've seen that often, brands will change direction or respond to things that consumers are demanding, or, consumer, whether you're an activist or just a shopper or whatever, they're really there to serve us, aren't they? So they will respond if there's enough of, a conversation going by that. So I think we can use our voice. We can write to our MP, we can sign petitions, we can, look at social media, we can, educate ourselves in a way, and then have that conversation with friends and family, because a lot of research suggests that the way that people become more sustainable in their habits is because their family's doing it, their friends are doing it, their neighbours doing it. It just becomes what you do, doesn't it? So it's not really a big change in behaviour. So if we could spread the message amongst households, neighbourhoods and so on, there's lots of things we can do really in terms of avoiding this kind of compulsive shopping. And I know it's hard because there's so much temptation, isn't there? Like constantly barrage of email marketing, social media marketing, influencers saying, buy this, buy that, buy the other, new collection, big sale, 70% off. It's really hard to resist, isn't it? But, I think if we can avoid that kind of thoughtless purchasing, and let's be honest, you don't often buy your best gear in those situations, do you? So we should try to buy, things that fit us. A lot of evidence suggests that people are more likely to keep hold of stuff that fits. That's one of the main reasons for things getting disposed of or not worn. It doesn't quite fit properly. It's so important, isn't it? So fit is really important. Buying what you need, buy for the lifestyle you have, not the lifestyle you want. I've made those mistakes, but I'm not really going to gala dinners every night, so I don't need that kind of clothing. It doesn't get worn, does it? And if you are going to a special occasion, think about renting something. You don't need to buy something at, whatever cost that you're just going to wear once and it's going to sit in the wardrobe. There's a huge amount of unworn clothing in UK wardrobes. And a few years ago, a survey suggested it was up to I think it's around £30 billion worth of unworn clothing. So it suggests we are hoarding stuff and not wearing it, and we still have nothing to wear. And in fact, in the UK, we buy more clothing per head of the population than anywhere else in Europe. And it's, we're sort of wasting money in a way, aren't we? So we might find that actually you can save quite a lot of money, which you can use to spend on other things rather than just pointlessly buying clothing that you don't really like and you don't end up wearing. Think about learning to repair things as well, or maybe find somebody in the family, there's normally a grandma or somebody like that still has those skills, or maybe somebody in your community. Is there any things like repair cafes? It's often a great opportunity to meet other people and get to know people in the community and foster those social connections. Or I quite like going to clothing swaps as well. So it's a way of updating your wardrobe, giving in a few things that you don't wear anymore, taking somebody else's donated stuff and not buying more new stuff. And also it's a great way to socialize as well in a way, because it's less lonely than kind of sitting at home scrolling through websites and purchasing things. So there's quite a lot we can do, but it does require some thought, doesn't it?
It really does, but you know what though, it really does help with empowerment though. That the people do have a lot of options out there and a lot of different ways to make a difference. Patsy, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation with you. I've really enjoyed this, and I think you've outlined really well the policy challenges, but right the way through some of the implications of those challenges, and then some of the things that we can actually do. So I always like to end a podcast on an optimistic note. So thank you very much for coming along and giving us your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thanks, David.
And that just leaves me to thank both my guests, Dermot McGilloway from St Vincent de Paul and Dr. Patsy Perry from Manchester Metropolitan University for sharing their insights with us today on the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. And also thank you very much for listening. Thank you for listening to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can be reminded of future episodes.